So what does far left, especially Marxist philosophy, mean? Of course, lots of things that we said, so I'm just going to give you a thumbnail thing here, but here's a few things. 4 claims of classical socialism, Marxist version. Right? 2 of them are going to be moral claims. If you compare capitalism to socialism, which one is morally superior and which one is morally inferior? Right? So there's the moral agenda. And Marx, as we know, right, thought economics was the mother science, the foundation, right, of everything that is built upon it. Foundational economic claims about the economic productivity of capitalism compared to socialism. And this is worked out by Marx and his colleague Engels primarily and others in the middle part of the 1800s. Right? Communist Manifesto was published in 1848. Right? So hold that date in your mind. So, first, the moral claims. Capitalism is exploitative. You have rich people, you have poor people. The rich people have the power. They use their power to keep the poor people down and to extract, right, wealth from them. It's competitive, it's imperialistic, and so the capitalist profit motive brings out the worst in people, and it's a dog-eat-dog struggle, right, and so forth. Socialism, then, is moral because it rejects the impetus of capitalism, the competition, the class society basis. Instead, it's committed to humanity, it's committed to peace, everybody is going to share, and we're going to try to keep people equal. All right, so, moral claim. Capitalism seems to be doing all right and is more productive than feudalism was, right? But ultimately, it's going to be less productive than socialism, the Marxists, right, are claiming, right? Because it's got these internal contradictions that are going to work their way out, and as a result of that, it's not going to be able to keep its act together. The poor get poorer, the rich get richer. This causes internal conflict right within the advanced capitalist societies, and the whole thing then will collapse in revolution. Socialist economies, by contrast, they will be more prosperous because people are going to be working with each other instead of against each other. And at least in the early stages, we're going to have a dictatorship of the proletariat, but the dictatorship will be wise, benevolent leaders who are able to assess the economy as a whole and make proper allocations of resources and distribute things right appropriately. And so we will be much more right productive. So a pair of moral claims and a pair of economic claims. Classical Marxist socialism. Now, the other thing I want to add to this is that Marxism labels itself as scientific socialism. Right? So it's socialism, but we're not just abstract dreamers. We are socialists who think. We have studied the way the world works. The iron laws of economics, right, are going to work out. Human nature, we have the right theory of it. This theory yields definite predictions about the way the world is going to go, and we are going to stand on those predictions. We are scientific about this. Right? This is not utopia. It's reality. So, another death by PowerPoint chart. Right? Let me talk you through it. Marxism is a class analysis, right? So let's take this slogan, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. We all know that one, but we'll tease it out. What does that mean when we actually apply it to a social scientific understanding of the way capitalist society works? Well, we say we have 3 classes. We have the working class, the proletariat. We have a middle class, because there had been a rising middle class, and we have the upper class. The working class, they're weak, they're poor, right? They don't have much status. The middle class, they're comfortable, but they're unstable. And the upper class are the powerful and the rich people. Okay, so that's where they are initially. Initially, what's going on then in capitalist societies is, of course, the poor are being exploited. Right? The wealth is being extracted from them. There's so many of them. Wages are pushed down. Capitalists get to make all of the rules. They control the government so they can extract as much wealth as they want. And so these guys are exploited, and it's very hard for them to get out of their condition, if not, right, impossible. And so they're basically going to, as Marxism predicts, become more and more people in the population. So the prediction then is going to be, as capitalism advances, more and more people will be forced into poverty, right, as a result of the capitalist dynamic. The middle class, right, they're unstable because the logical capitalist competition, right, says there's winners and there's losers, and we're all competing with each other. Some people in the middle class will succeed in clawing their way up to the rich class, but the most of them are going to at some point make a mistake, right, or they're going to be outcompeted and they'll be forced down into the proletariat. So the claim of classical Marxism is that the middle class really has no future. It's going to be squeezed out, right? And that then predicts population should asymptotically approach 0, right, for the future. And the rich, right, start off, they're exploiting and ruthless, they've got all the power, but of course, they're all competing with each other, right? Because if you're a millionaire, you want to be a 100 millionaire, then you want to be a billionaire. And if you're a Marxist, you believe that's zero-sum competition. And so the logic then is to say fewer and fewer rich people will succeed at this ruthless competition, and they will slowly amass all of the wealth in their own hands, and then all of the other former semi-rich people will be forced down, right, the chain of command. So we have then three social science predictions that we make, right? Population of the people in poverty will go up dramatically under capitalism. The middle class will shrink to nothingness, and the rich class, the bourgeoisie, will also shrink to a very small number. Now, the problem then is going to be, and I'm going to say this is a problem, that even in Marx's lifetime, and certainly in the succeeding generations, right, of Marxists, by the time we get to 1900, right, 1920, right, and so forth, and we march our way through, is that all three of those predictions failed. And it's not just that they failed by a little bit, right, or that the data was mixed, but that all of the data is showing that the exact opposite, right, is coming to pass. If you look at poverty rates under the more capitalistic nations, rather than more people living in poverty, poverty rates are going down. They're going down significantly. That's an opposite. The middle class is supposed to be becoming smaller and smaller. Instead, what is happening is it's getting bigger and significantly bigger. The number of people who are rich is supposed to be getting smaller and smaller, but the problem is the number of rich people is getting more and more. Right? Damn it, there's just more and more millionaires, right? And then billionaires, right, and so forth. Now, this is a problem because if you think of Marxism as social science stands on its predictions as measured against the data. And by every measure, right, Marxist social science failed to fit the data. In fact, the data was the exact opposite. And this caused a crisis, not only by people who are not sympathetic to Marxism say, ha, 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 you Marxists got it all wrong, but a crisis within Marxism. And what you find when you read the Marxists of each succeeding generation is they are aware of the data. We predicted this, but now the data says that. What do we do? And of course, we need to start tweaking the theory, right, in various ways, but this is a problem. And as the generations go on and the predictions get worse and worse, right, the problem gets more and more. Now, I want to say that the crisis reached a head again by the time we get to the 1950s. And the reason for that is important, partly because if you look at the first half of the 20th century, right, the Marxists had said World War I. Right, the Marxist theory of World War I is it's all the capitalist countries getting together and going to war over resources. And what's going to happen is the capitalist countries will basically kill each other off or weaken each other, and that will provide a space for the communist revolution of some sort, right, to fill the vacuum. That didn't happen. But good news, depression, right? The Great Depression happened. Marxist theory says, right, this is the final death throes of capitalism, stock market excesses, capitalists getting greedy, et cetera, et cetera. Capitalism is over, and out of the economic collapse, right, the proletariat will get their act together and we will have revolution. That didn't happen. World War II, well, this is one that's a little bit more complicated because we've got the communist nations fighting the fascist nations, fighting the liberal democratic nations. But the theory was going to be that the fascists and the liberal capitalists would weaken each other, and then communists, if they bided their time and thought strategically, by the time, right, one killed the other, the remaining one would be weakened and we would be able to kill them, and then communist revolution of some sort, right, once again. By the time you get to the 1950s, though, it's clear that's not going to happen. Because what's happening in the 1950s? Well, fascism is gone. Right? It's probably coming back, unfortunately, right? But it's gone, right? And we do then have the familiar Cold War contours, right, of the Soviet Union versus the left or the liberal democratic nations, right, in the West. But the liberal capitalist nations have recovered from World War I, from the Depression, from World War II, and things are pretty good, right, if you start looking at what's going on. The poor in the 1950s in the capitalist countries, right, they're all buying cars and television sets, right, and the interstate has been built, so they're taking all these trips, right, And international flight is increasingly available to everyone. Everybody's enjoying all of these movies, right? And eating better, and people are getting taller, et cetera, et cetera. So by the time we get to the 1950s, if you are on the very far left and sympathetic to Marxism, it's not looking good, right, in terms of the data. So it gets worse. We've had 100 years of waiting for the revolution. Hasn't happened. Capitalists are doing better and better, it seems. But what about those moral claims? Capitalism is inhumane. Well, of course, there's lots of things we can complain about, how Canadians have treated each other, right, and how Americans have treated each other, and human rights issues, right, and so forth. In the grand scheme of things, those are important, but relatively light by historical standards. By and large, you get a pretty good chance of putting together a pretty good life if you're living in one of those countries. But on the other side, right, two crushing blows happened in 1956. Right? And these were crushing blows to Western Marxists especially, because for a generation, Western Marxists had thought, despite the predictions about the economic modeling, right, and so forth, at least we have the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union is a beacon of our humane, moral future. It's a communist revolution that succeeded. Right? And Stalin, Papa Joe, right, is at the helm with the power to do what is necessary to usher the Soviet Union and therefore eventually the rest of the world in the right direction. An almost messianic, right, fervor about what was going on in the Soviet Union. Right? Any number of fellow travelers go over there, they take the tours, they come back, right, glowing, right, reports. 1956, right, Stalin has died, Khrushchev has consolidated power, and he announces in a speech that all of those stories about genocide, about the asylums, about the torture, about Siberia were true. It wasn't just CIA propaganda. It was all right. Tens of millions, right, of people tortured, starved, exterminated, right, under what was supposed to be the humanest social system that ever existed. How is this possible? 1956 also in Hungary, one of the satellite states, right, now behind the Iron Curtain. Things aren't going very well economically. Students in university classes are chafing at having to take only Communist Party propaganda right in their courses. Right? They want a more liberal curriculum. They want to have jobs when they get out. Workers are hungry. Right? And so there are protests that are starting, peaceful protests. Well, we know socialist governments care about their people. They care about the workers. They care about the students. The reaction of the Hungarian government was to call up Moscow, say we got big problems here. Moscow sent in the troops, sent in the tanks, and protesters are shot. The ringleaders are dragged off to prison. They are tortured, forced to give up their allies, who are then arrested and tortured, and tanks are sent into the protesters and ride over people. And Western technology, for the first time, this is shown on international television. Everybody sees it. It's not just CIA propaganda again. How is this possible? This is a crisis of faith in the 1950s. So, the old left, that is to say, the Marxist left, is in trouble. What are we going to do? And what do you do if you are a young person in your late 20s and early 30s, strongly committed to your politics, and you're really, really smart? Okay. Well, you re-strategize. And so one of the things that we do know that happened is this is exactly when the new left started. So we have a new left, a new agenda, right, and so forth. And the point is going to be that that agenda, right, is being set by the strategists, and the strategists are the most philosophically minded of them, and we know who those people are going to be. So this is the second thesis, that is to say that by the time you get to the 1950s, what has happened is, yes, philosophy is at a very skeptical place epistemologically. But at the same time, people on the far left are going through a crisis about what we are supposed to do now that our youthful dreams in the classical Marxist ideal have failed. And even all kinds of neo-Marxism have been tried, those have failed. And the practical results in the Soviet Union and other places as tried have failed. We need to do some serious thinking. Now, I've used the word faith. And I want to say that there is exactly a parallel here. Because if we think about the kinds of uses of faith that we're more familiar with, what happens if you're an intelligent young person and you believe a certain religious worldview? Right? Typically, you come to believe that it's true, it explains a lot of things, but it also has a strong normative component. You believe that it is moral and decent, and that it's the hope for humanity that your religious vision come to prevail more. Right? But then you start to grow up, and you start to realize that there are lots of smart people who believe very different things, right, about religion. You start to have arguments with them, and sometimes they've got really good arguments. Right? And you find yourself questioning, right, on the basis of the evidence and the data, whether your religious views, right, are true. Yeah? And sometimes you reach the conclusion that, you know, I don't actually think the arguments for my religion are that good. A lot of holes have been poked in them. They can't be true. And these various alternative religions, including non-religions, the arguments for them are pretty compelling. So we have a crisis, right, of faith that, of course, we know millions of people go through. And to put it in polarized terms, it's, am I going to go with what seems to be the best arguments, the best logic, the best evidence, to go with my reason? Or am I going to go with what I really want to be true, which is to say, this religious view that has formed part of my identity and my understanding of what is beautifully and nobly possible for human beings? And what choice do I make? And when it's that polarized, you really have two choices. One choice is to say, you know, the most important thing is the facts, the truth. And I have to go with the logic, I have to go with the evidence, and that means, as hard as it might be for me emotionally, I have to abandon the religion of my youth. I have to live without that religion, adopt some other more rational religion, or possibly live without religion at all, because objectivity and reasoning matter. And some people do it down that road. But the other option then is to say, you know, I'm going to believe what I want to believe. There's no way I can give up this beautiful, deep part of my identity. And that means that I have to find some way to get rid of the logic, the evidence, and the commitment to reason. That I'm going to elevate a subjective commitment to something I want to be true over reason. And we do know in the history then of religion that there are many religious strategists who take that route. Limit reason, crucify reason, set aside reason in order to rejuvenate personal faith commitments. Now that exact same psychology carries over to politics. And that's the claim I'm making here about the 1950s socialists. The smart ones recognized that the arguments for socialism had been destroyed. Mises, Hayek, and the others, and all of the empirical data, right, that was out there. There's no way to give a rational explication for the economic superiority of socialism, right, over capitalism. And the data shows that the socialist nations have been brutal in practice. And that by and large, whatever our gripes are about the West, things are pretty good, morally speaking. But if you're a committed socialist, you're at a crisis at this point because you believe that capitalism is evil and socialism is moral. But the logic says the opposite. Do you go with what you want to believe, your socialist ideal, or do you go with the logic? And we do know, again, some people make the different choices. Some people say, okay, I need to modify my socialism, abandon socialism, and move toward some sort of liberal democratic understanding. But a lot of people double down and say, I am going to find a more sophisticated way to bracket reason, bracket the evidence, bracket the idea that on politics, reason, evidence, and logic is fundamental. And that's the postmodern move right there. Another colleague at Duke University, Frederick Jamerson, right, a Marxist theorist, right, at exactly this juncture says, yes, we are aware of Marxism's and neo-Marxism history. We're aware of how things have gone right in the West, and we do know it is evidence versus political commitment, and he's making his point clear. Everything in the last analysis is politics. Your political commitments are fundamental. Everything will be shaped to fit the political commitments.